Hi, Red Shirt here. I'd like to talk about class society. That happens to be the era we're in right now. It's very important to understand what it is. First off, we have to understand what class means. Class does not mean income level. We have a term for that already. It's income level. Class is actually a description of a relationship of a person to the means of production. That is, the means of production of wealth. So, for example, the working class produces most of the wealth in the world. I would say, together with farmers, workers and farmers. Now, farmers are middle class, and there are several groups of middle class. The ruling class in this society happens to be the capitalist class. That's the dominant class in the world today. They are the people who own the wealth and control the wealth through various means. So you have on one side the ruling class, which is the capitalist class, and the other opposite end is the working class who produce the wealth. In the middle are middle layers like farmers who own their own property generally. Now, farm workers are working class, of course, but farmers are middle class. And managers that stand in for the owners, they're middle class. Small business people, middle business people are middle class, of course, and professionals are middle class. Students are middle class. So that's class. We have to understand that in order to get what class society really is. Now, class society really started 10,000 years ago. Let's be real clear about that, because for 300,000 years the human race existed without class society. Only during the last 10,000 years, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, do we find the beginning of class society. And you could call all of class society a plutocracy. Plutocracy means rule of the rich, rule of the wealthy. And that started 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. Let's take a look at how our ancestors lived before that, during the 300,000 years of Homo sapien, when people lived as forager hunters, nomadic, in a situation where there was no government. There was no government. There was no one telling anyone what to do, because there was no wealth. The only thing that was valuable was what you and your clan collected that morning to eat, you see. And then the rest of the afternoon you could goof off, and then in the evening you had a feast where you ate it. Vegetables and fruits and meats and fish and whatnot, that kind of Paleolithic diet, it doesn't keep very well. You can't store it very well. You can salt it, you can smoke it, but it's going to degenerate very quickly. So there was no wealth, you see, to accumulate. Now, along comes agriculture. People discover that if you plant grains and legumes and they grow up, you can harvest a whole lot of food, more food than you actually need. And you can store that food. You keep it dry, you keep it away from the rodents and other pests. And what do you know? You've got wealth. I mean, back then, 2,000 years ago, the only wealth was food. And anyone who had control of that food, priests and strong workers, well, they owned that wealth. Now, when a famine comes along and suddenly the crops die, who has the power? Well, the people who control that wealth, the people who control the grains and the legumes, the granaries, in other words. They could dole out food to those who do what they're told. You see, and that's how it all started. And that's what we have today. Now you continue that all the way through 10,000 years, what you find is not a single democracy, we should say. Democracy we would define as rule of the majority of people, right? I mean, that's a logical definition of democracy. It's where 51% of the people make the decisions, right? Well, we never had that. We haven't had that. Um, I would make Cuba an exception today in 2020, and we'll do a whole segment on Cuba later, which is actually a worker state, a healthy worker state. But even Athens was not democratic. They invented the word democracy, but slaves had no rights. Women had no rights at all. And immigrants had no rights at all. So you can't say that the majority of the people there made the decisions. They just broadened the plutocracy. The huge landowners broadened out the decision making and the discussions and the decision making somewhat. It started in Athens, really, because they needed rowers for their navy, and you can't make slaves. Slaves don't make really good rowers. They never had slaves on galleys back in the ancient days, anyway. That's a big Hollywood myth. They had to pay people, so they had to pay a whole lot of citizens, free citizens, to row, and those people wanted some say, anyway. But it was never a democracy. That's just a big myth. Okay. So now back then, like 10,000 years ago, the rulers, the people who had the money, the people who had the power, had to divide up the toilers. They had to divide us in 100 different ways. The first way was men versus women. Well, men are bigger and stronger and can beat up women. Right? And so they gave men the right to own women and children. And of course, the purpose of that was to pass on their accumulated wealth to boys who looked just like them. In other words, that was the invention of fatherhood, really, because before that, everybody lived with their mother's clan. There was no strict pair bonding like we have today. That was the beginning of the patriarchy. That was also the beginning of all kinds of discrimination to divide up the toilers against ourselves. Very handy back then. So when we come up to today and we talk about capitalism as the problem, keep in mind that capitalism is the last stage of class society. So this is not just getting rid of capitalism. This is getting rid of class society. This has only been around for 10,000 years. So when you look at 300,000 years of our existence and 10,000 years, we're looking at 30 to 1. So be careful of people who talk about human nature as being warlike and awful and horrible and this and that, because they're only looking at the last one. They're not looking at the previous 30. And that's what I'm doing here. And we'll talk about, that's called primitive communism, by the way, that 300,000 years of no government and no wealth. And I'll do a whole segment on that later on. So we're not talking about utopia, by the way. So, a revolution, we're not talking about getting rid of class society and suddenly we're in utopia. We're talking about getting off a ship that's going down and getting into the lifeboats to try to find an island to live on. We're trying to save our lives here, because the end of class society can go either right or wrong, horribly wrong or wonderfully right, depending on how we conduct ourselves. Okay, so class consciousness really means that you understand what class society is, you understand when it started, you understand that it's the plutocrats versus the toilers, and that the toilers will, by gaining victories, will win over all the middle layers, all the middle classes will come to our side. And that's what we have to do, is build the unions in order for the toilers to gain strength, in order to create a revolution. And this whole class society, this whole 10,000 years, this whole post-agricultural society is like a shifting of gears. So it's not a detour, it's not a mistake, it's exactly what we needed, and now it's time to shift into second gear. So it's been in first gear all this time. And now, a gear shift is a disruption. So it's very disruptive. Our lives are completely disrupted because change change is occurring exponentially. It's not linear. So get ready for change, everybody. And, until next time, read the militant newspaper printed and published in the interests of working people, and keep fighting.